And first of all, thank you all for being here. So good afternoon from Geneva, and welcome to this UNIDIR webinar on large language models and international security. My name is Jana Pushkash. I'm a researcher in the Security and Technology program at UNIDIR, and I will moderate the webinar. In today's webinar, we will discuss LLMs in the context of international security. LLMs are best known for their use in powering generative AI systems such as chatbots, but of course the range of applications of this technology is much broader. There are several ways to consider the implications of LLMs for international security, and that includes potential uses in the military domain, where LLMs could be employed to inform military intelligence and planning, but also outside of strictly military use. There are other ways in which LLMs can impact international security. For example, there are growing concerns that vulnerabilities may be exploited by malicious actors who could bypass system safeguards and use LLMs to generate malware or even create new pathogens. So we are joined today by an interdisciplinary group of experts who will help us unpack and also demystify some of the critical aspects of this technology. I will briefly introduce the speakers, and then I will invite each of them to take the floor for a few brief remarks. And at the end, for about 15 to 20 minutes, we will have a Q&A session. So our first speaker today is Rita Sebastianova, who's a researcher at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, or ETH Zurich, and she will help us frame our discussion today by providing a technical description of what LLMs are, including some key ideas about explainability. Then we have Dan Tadros, who's the head of federal delivery at Scale AI, who will share some remarks on key applications in the military domain, and also how LLMs could be employed for military decision support. Richard Carter, our third speaker, is a senior visiting fellow and strategy advisor for the Center for Emerging Technology and Security at Alan Turing Institute, and also CEO of Tulpa AI. He will provide an overview of potential uses of LLMs in the intelligence domain. Jessica G is a research analyst for the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, and she will discuss the potential of LLMs to be employed for malicious use, or also cover a few key areas related to risks and vulnerabilities of the technology. And last but certainly not least, we have Haonan Lee, who's a fellow at the Mohammed bin Zayed University of Artificial Intelligence, and his remarks will focus on red teaming and some of the challenges related to open models, as well as building LLMs for languages other than English. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, the team that he's part of helped build the largest Arabic language model called JAIS. So just to move forward, I will now hand it over directly to Rita, who will describe for us how LLMs work. So Rita, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm Rita Sebastianova. I'm a postdoc in the lab of Mena El Asadi at the ETH Zurich. And probably how most of you have already worked with the ChatGPT interface, and all of us know that these large language models can be used to generate text, to answer our questions, or to follow our instructions. So what stands behind these models is so-called transformer-based architecture. And the transformer-based architecture, like there are different versions of it. This is an example of so-called these GPT models. And this particular architecture can be used to train a model that can generate a text word by word for the given input. And how it is done? It's basically we can take a lot of text examples in natural language. So we don't use any additional information here, just plain text in natural language. We put this into the model, and the model learns a representation of this text and is able to make the prediction for the next token. And how exactly the model does that is by representing these words within different contexts through so-called contextual word embeddings. And these are like high-dimensional vectors that can have like hundreds or thousands of dimensions. And these numbers somehow encode different properties of the surrounding context. In this case, like the prior context of the input word. And the information can be like different syntactic properties of the context, like semantics of the word's position, the word's class. And all this information is somehow encoded in these numbers. And actually, what the model or the architecture uses is so-called like attention-based mechanism, how these particular like weights are actually generated. But the idea is that these contextual representations are learned and updated throughout the model's architecture. And the model learns more and more nuances about the particular context. And at a very late state of like the training process, like or in the very upper layer of its architecture, the model is able to generate a prediction of the most likely token to be used for the given input based on these contextual representations. And when we have trained such a model, then we can use it for inference. So basically, we can provide a prompt to the model, input it to the model, and then the model will predict which word is likely to be used as next for the given input. And we can repeat this process as many times as we want to generate as long text as we want. But the process is done like word by word, or more precisely like token by token. And how exactly model does that is by creating probability distribution of like that shows how likely it is to use this particular word for the given input. And these probabilities are computed for the whole vocabulary that the model has seen during its pre-training. So the model from these contextual representations, it converts these contextual representations into probabilities, and then in this case, it could pick the most likely token. In this case, it would be like Obama following Barack here. You can imagine if we would always take the most likely token here, then the output will always stay the same for the same input. So it would be kind of boring. That's why what we can do is we can use the temperature sampling here, which adds some randomness in the text generation process, which means that the model will not always pick the most likely token, but it will pick one of the top tokens, and which will generate, in this case, like example, Barack Obama in some cases. In other cases, the model would output Barack Hussein, sometimes Barack worked, and things like that. So we can just make like the model more creative using this temperature sampling. And if you have worked like with the ChatGPT interface, you know that this model can like generate text and also follow your instructions and answer questions. So one typical approach, what can be done to teach the model to actually follow these instructions and answer questions, is additionally to fine-tune the model on additional data set. And this data set could contain like instruction response pairs or question answer pairs. And we just simply take the pre-trained model, add this additional data set on top, and teach the model to learn how to react to these instructions or how to answer particular questions. And the nice thing is with these large language models that they can generalize very well. So our dataset does not need to contain every single instruction response pair that is out there, but the model can learn these contextual representations, different concepts, their similarity, and basically you can use this model on new instructions, and the model doesn't need to see everything during its fine-tuning or pre-training phase, which is nice thing about these models. Then maybe something that you have also heard when like reading about the ChatGPT model and how it was trained. Another thing what can be used to teach the model to actually like produce output that aligns to the user's expectations is this reinforcement learning from human feedback approach, which basically means that we can additionally ask the model to generate multiple outputs for one input sequence and ask users to give feedback, to rate which output is actually better than others. And then we can gather such feedbacks from multiple users, use that as a data set to fine-tune the model using reinforcement learning, and the model will also update its parameters and be better aligned to that what actually like users prefer, what kind of output should be generated. So that's very short and summary kind of how these models do these things. That in combination, like this pre-training, fine-tuning, reinforcement learning has led us to really well-performing models on different tasks like natural language processing and understanding tasks. So you can use these models to summarize text, generate code. You can ask these models to answer your questions, and there are plenty of things that you can do with these models. At the same time, there are some risks that are still related to these models and that we need to consider when we work with these models. So first thing is that what happens in these situations when we have so well-performing models and if we have malicious actors that want to use these models. there is the risk that these models can be used to create harm, which means that since these models perform so well, these malicious actors could use these models to create more novel ideas how to create harm, or they could even support development of protocols for a threat creation, or even you could use large language model agents that can execute these processes or protocols automatically. So that is one direction, what kind of issues there might occur. At the same time, these models do not perform always 100% accurately because of the pre-training objective of these models. They have been trained to produce text word by word, and we add some randomness in the text generation process, which means that in some cases, the models will still produce hallucinations, which basically means that these models will produce false facts, but that's not what the model was trained on. Then also these models could produce hate speech, and also these models are still biased, there are different social gender biases encoded in model parameters. So when we use these models, we should be aware of the pre-training objective and that what kind of limitations there are. And this last point is kind of related to that what our lab does at the ETH. We are designing different interactive visualizations that help to gain insights, like what these models do, how they actually learn, what kind of biases are encoded there. We have this beam search tree representation here, where we basically just visualize different options of the model and what kind of likelihoods there are that the model will produce some biased output. At the same time, we also work with different embedding visualization methods to understand what kind of, in this case, stereotypes are encoded in model parameters, to understand whether we should optimize our training data, which probably would be the case, because typically what we feed in the model, we will also see similar outputs in the generated text. But yeah, it's just a small overview of a couple of visualizations in this direction. That is the focus of our lab, actually, is to create such visualizations to understand what these models do and how good they actually perform. So that's actually it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Rita. That was excellent, and really an excellent overview of a very complex technology. But now we will move with the next two speakers. We will move into the military and intelligence domain. So I will first invite Dan to take the floor, and then I will hand it over to Rich. But Dan, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be speaking with you all today. So just by way of background, so I served as an active duty Marine for 12 years before transitioning into the reserves. During my time on active duty, I actually was one of the founding members of the U.S. Department of Defense Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, where I developed a couple of different programs focused on force protection and autonomy. From there, I joined Scale, where I'm currently the head of federal delivery. So for the purposes of our conversation, focusing around military planning, which is where we've conducted the most experimentation. It's important to think military planning has remained largely unchanged since the advent of the Napoleonic staff structure, where aspects of the military operation were divided up across individuals. So at a high level, you could think the divisions of responsibility across operations, intelligence, logistics. Each of these groups is responsible for their roles and responsibilities, and as the plans are developed, integration needs to occur across each one of these divisions, which is where the modern-day challenges begin. When the entire area of responsibility was viewable by a commander on a hilltop and the whole staff was operating out of a single tent, and information moved as fast as a messenger on horseback, it was absolutely reasonable to integrate all of the available information and make a reasonably informed decision. Unfortunately, the military planning process has not kept pace with the new technologies. So as a result, today's staff and military decision makers are drowning in a sea of PowerPoints, PDFs, unprocessed imagery, and other sources of raw data. As a result of this inundation of data, the targeted and responsible application of narrow artificial intelligence can help to alleviate these challenges, but it must be applied in such a way that supports a strong human-machine teaming of human context and then artificial intelligence's ability to transform enormous amounts of data into useful information. So to that end, working with the United States Marine Corps' School of Advanced Warfighting, which is where Marine Corps and other top-performing officers from the U.S. and our allies train to become operational planners, and under the direction of their faculty, specifically Dr. Ben Jensen, a senior fellow at CSIS, we have been working to determine the best implementation for AI to support operational planning and decision support. So during some of our experimentations, we have found that that the doctrine of how military planning occurs actually remains largely unchanged. They still follow the process that exists, but the introduction of AI into that process meant that planners were able to consider a broader range of information available. And in our experiments, we loaded our AI platform with 60,000 pages of doctrine, historical context, economic data, and other relevant sources that were then immediately available through Scale's Donovan platform. And by having those resources available, we began to see some emergent behavior from the students that we were experimenting with. So for example, assumptions that were being made to support the decision-making process were then validated or invalidated by querying the system and then debated within the participants. What's key here to think about is that the participants did not default to the large language model blindly and just give it agency over the planning process. Instead, they used it as a tool to help balance their creativity, their assumptions, and their understanding of the operational environment. As the planning continued, users were able to explore a wider swath of data available, and they were able to do that quickly and efficiently as well as add other adjudicated data sources to the corpus to support exploration of solutions to to identify non-traditional solutions to national security challenges. This includes how to better utilize other levers of national power and interagency support between, say, Department of Defense, Commerce, State Department, etc. Again, this is all within a training environment to identify the art of the possible. And the intent was to identify de-escalation opportunities that were non-traditional from a pure military standpoint. As further experiments are conducted, we will continue to explore the application of AI into the military decision-making as a way to amplify the competitive advantage of professional military organizations, which is the creativity and intelligence of the officers and non-commissioned officers of the planning commands, to augment their process and provide time and cognitive bandwidth to identify solutions to an increasingly complex set of global challenges. So again, thank you for your time today. Look forward to any questions that might come up.
Thank you very much. I will have a follow-up question in the Q&A for you. There are some very interesting points that you raised. But now I will just move on to Rich, who will cover another sort of related aspect of LLM use, which is the use of LLMs in the intelligence domain. So Rich, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ioana. Okay, so hopefully you can all hear me okay. So yes, so brief background to me. So I've been in and around the UK national security community for about 20 years. And most recently, I have two jobs, if you like. I'm a senior visiting fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, part of the Centre for Emerging Technology and Security, and I'll talk about some of the work I was doing last year in a moment. And I'm also the CEO and founder of a human machine teaming company called Tulpa. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the work that I did with Adam C. So Adam is, his surname isn't C, that's been abbreviated for security reasons. He's the current chief data scientist at the government communications headquarters, GCHQ in the UK. And so Adam and I last year, we published this report. I'll give you a link to the report at the end, where we answered this question: where do we think that large language models could be used to help intelligence analysts? So to get right to it, probably won't be a great surprise actually what we've identified, but certainly translation, it consumes a lot of time. There's a lot of data There's a lot of collected intelligence that needs to be translated. The intelligence community have been using computer models to do translation for a long time, but actually the sophistication that you get from large language models is a significant step up on traditional translation engines, mainly because large language models are much better at understanding context around the way words are used and how people might use colloquialisms in text and stuff like that. Summarization, again, looking at a very big report or something, you very quickly need to understand, do I need to read this whole 200-page report? So chuck it into a large language model, see if it's got keywords in there that you might be interested in. And again, it's not just about finding keywords, it's about the semantic, it's the meaning around how a particular word may be being used. Dialogue, we're most familiar with this, I think, as individuals, because this is the chatbot land. This is mainly in intelligence analysis. This is mainly finding value in teaching people, actually. So if you point a large language model using techniques like retrieval augmented generation at your corporate playbook, then people can very quickly figure out some pretty mandronic stuff, such as how do I get this warrant signed off and things like that. So again, it's just about productivity improvement with dialogue. Knowledge search, this is the big area for intelligence analysis. And as Rita was saying at the beginning, there's always the risk, there's quite a few risks with using large language models, particularly in high stakes applications like intelligence. But actually there's a very large dose of pragmatism in the intelligence community around large language models. Particularly GCHQ, it's a very technically savvy organization. They really understand these AI models inside out, so they know what they're getting into by using them. And they are risky to use because of hallucinations and bias and so on. But actually, the deep pragmatism that I'm talking about is simply the fact that an intelligence analyst, the sheer scale of data that an intelligence analyst has to look at nowadays is just beyond the ability of any single organization to actually look at all the data that's collected. It's a fraction. The data that's collected, only a fraction of it actually gets looked at. So there is a risk management thing here, which is I would rather use a large language model to look at something, to do some knowledge search, to try and find out if there is something of interest in that particular data set, and for it to tell me that there is something, and then I will go look at it. It's better to have, if you like, that false positive, and you spend time actually then digging into to find out whether or not that output was actually true, than not even looking at the data at all. So knowledge search is a big area for intelligence analysis. Content generation, less so, mainly because if you think about the intelligence process as a funnel, so you get all the collection up front end at the wide end of the funnel, and as the funnel narrows and we get down to actually intelligence reporting, and then some intelligence then goes to a key decision maker in government or the military, there's a lot of checks and balances that happen as data becomes information, and then information becomes knowledge, and then that becomes intelligence. And content generation tends to sit more at the customer facing end, and there's a large amount of healthy skepticism about letting large language models generate intelligence reports. That's just not something that's going to happen anytime soon. And even if it is, an intelligence analyst would almost use the large language model as an extremely naive, extremely junior member of the team. So the analyst will be expected to have to crawl all over that intelligence report that might have been produced by an LLM. So the utility there is an obvious area, but it's actually probably going to see less implementation. And then, of course, it's coding as well, which there's a lot of customized support that intelligence analysts need because the world changes often. So having faster time to market for new applications, new software solutions for them is really key. So there's the applications. Just really quickly, just talk about some of the concerns about LLMs for intelligence analysis. Well, actually, Rita's already covered these really well, so I can skip over some of these. Automation bias is really, it's one of the things that the GCHQ are really looking at. How do we manage how an intelligence analyst appropriately calibrates the level of trust that they should have in the output from a large language model? Anthropomorphization, how do we make sure that we give people the training to spot when they are anthropomorphizing, when they're projecting human emotions and human behaviors onto a chatbot. There's all sorts of really quite tricky cognitive biases that anthropomorphization introduces, and that actually the intelligence community has spent decades ironing out human cognitive biases. Anthropomorphization is kind of like a backdoor to reintroduce people's things like confirmation bias and things like that. Security vulnerabilities, if the intelligence community become very dependent on a certain type of large language model, they've invested a lot of time and effort into it, they need to be absolutely sure that that model is secure, that it can't be interfered with, that it can't be prompt hacked in a way that it's going to expose sensitive information. It's not going to be easy to be stolen or things like that. We haven't talked about this yet so far, but I get, given the topic of this this webinar, how LLMs add to the problem space for intelligence analysts makes dangerous knowledge easier to access. In fact, I think Rita, you might have mentioned some of this. Conversational prowess provides emotional support to lone wolf actors. Often overlooked is the human relationship with chatbots, not necessarily the knowledge that's in chatbots. And destabilizing legitimate political processes due to mass scale generation of very realistic fake content. I think we're becoming more aware of these kind of risks from the use of LLMs. And diminished cybersecurity standards due to automation of code generation. How do we verify that the code being generated by an LLM is actually not introducing some sort of backdoor for malicious actors? So that's it, just a brief canter through some of the stuff we had in the report. Please visit the CTAS website. I'll give you the link there. And please also get in touch with me if you'd like to chat more about what I do at the Turing Institute, or indeed what my company Tulpa is doing as well in this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rich. That was super interesting and very, very relevant for our discussion, and also very nice continuation of what Dan was presenting just a few minutes before. So now we'll move on to some of the broader considerations of safety and security of LLM systems, including their potential to be deliberately misused. So first, I will invite Jessica to take the floor and share a few remarks on this, and finally Haonan. But Jessica, please, you have the floor.
Yep, thank you. All right, so hi everyone, thanks for having me. My name is Jessica. I am a research analyst at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, which is as you notice from the name, it's kind of like a mirror organization to CTAS in the UK. We're a policy think tank based at Georgetown University in Washington, DC. And I work on a team that specifically looks at the intersection of cybersecurity and AI. So I'll be focusing on that as kind of like a mini case study just to try to narrow it down. I think the conversation about potential risks in this space is pretty immense. And there's been a lot of coverage. So I think part of my goal here will just be to contextualize some of the discussion around risk and how we, at least in this like research space, trying to inform policymakers, are thinking about how to evaluate like the feasibility of some of the technology and also the risks. So this will be pretty short, but it's split into two halves. So first I'll talk about risks associated with outputs, looking specifically at kind of like our current understanding of whether or not LLMs are likely, or like how they are being used for offensive cyber attacks or cyber operations. And then I'll just conclude briefly by talking a little bit about the like security vulnerabilities of LLMs that Rich mentioned at the end of his talk, and also like how introducing this technology may also increase risks in perhaps unexpected ways. So very briefly, I think I'm not going to cover all of this, but I'm going to focus mostly on the malicious use case on the left hand of the chart here. I think so specifically offensive cyber operations is what I'll be talking about, but I think there's been a lot of media and also policy interest in the potential for LLMs to be used maliciously, particularly for weapon creation and disinformation. But I also want to emphasize that I think the unintended consequences, meaning unintended by users, is also an important kind of like risk base to think about. We've briefly mentioned hallucinations and incorrect information, but I think there are all kinds of other potential outcomes that we're starting to see manifest, but we probably, again, don't fully understand the ramifications of like the different contexts in which people are using LLMs and all of the potential consequences that may come from that. So, but I'll be focusing mostly on malicious use for now. So I think going back to the question of can LLMs really empower offensive cyber actors? Recently, we have a useful example from February of this year. This is a post published by the Microsoft Threat Intelligence team, in which they identified several state-affiliated cyber actors actually using OpenAI's GPT-4 to try to explore cyber operations. And basically, these are some of the most capable and advanced cyber actors in the world. So looking at kind of like the high end of skill, how are these actors using these tools? And what they found is they're basically using them as productivity tools. So doing research and reconnaissance, some like translation between human languages, some basic scripting and code writing, and also writing things like phishing emails. But the authors say they did not observe, novel or unique AI-enabled attack or abuse techniques. So I think this is a kind of a good.
Jessica, sorry, just to say that we cannot see your slides right now.
Oh.
They're not moving on, Jessica. I can see your PowerPoint window, but the slides aren't moving on.
Oh, great. Okay. Thanks for letting me know. I will stop and then reshare. Oh, it's going on. Okay. Sorry about that. Let me reshare really quickly. I've lost the PowerPoint window entirely, so I can just go on without the PowerPoint. But okay, so basically, I think from this example of how advanced state level threat cyber actors are using LLMs, I think we are at a state where we, based on our current capabilities or the current capabilities of LLMs, our worst case scenarios, so the scenarios in which we see highly advanced malware with a single prompt, or autonomous cyber attacks launched, with minimal human involvement, are very infeasible or unlikely to occur at this stage. But I think this means that we also need ways to monitor the capability of AI tools, because currently we're still trying to figure out exactly what these tools are capable of. And in the near term, I think we see that AI tools are more likely to impact the volume of cyber attacks rather than their complexity. And the most advanced cyber threat actors will likely benefit the most because human expertise is still really valuable, especially for these technical fields. However, we have seen that AI tools will generally lower the barrier to entry for certain types of operations, such as phishing and other types of social engineering. And I think we've seen this a lot with spam and fraud, in that certain things such as voice impersonation are much easier than they were just a few months or years ago because of AI tools to the public. Okay, so I don't have a visualization for this, but I'll just say that on the flip side of this, LLMs are also vulnerable to attack themselves. So they are, essentially pieces of software. When you embed them into a system, especially in security relevant domains, we were just talking about like the military and intelligence domains, they become essentially pieces of software that are also vulnerable to attack. So they can be attacked along many vectors. There are attacks that target their input, such as data poisoning. An attacker might do this in order to try to change the output or the behavior of the model. You can attack the model itself in order to try to steal information about it. You can try to steal it or parts of it. This can be relevant for industrial espionage. Or we have seen a lot of what are called jailbreaks, which are attacks on the LLM guardrails or even on the application or the interface that's hosting the language model. And these can be used, to try to reveal to get the model to reveal sensitive data, data that it's been trained on. And this, I think, is particularly relevant in these sensitive or security relevant domains, because specialized data may be a factor that really impacts whether or not these models are useful in these cases. And if your model has been trained or is exposed to sensitive internal data, and an attacker can basically interface with the model and get it to elicit that data, then that's, I think, kind of a relatively novel vulnerability. that I think should be considered when we're talking about using these models in the security domain. So basically, in conclusion, they need to be secured like any other piece of software. The data is important. And also I want to go back to something that I think Rita mentioned briefly in her part, which was that these outputs are kind of inherently difficult to control. So she mentioned reinforcement learning with human feedback. This is a technique that developers use to try to like shape and guide the model's behavior. But I think there is a level of kind of unpredictability that's just inherent to the technology. And we're still also like kind of like controlling and ensuring that models behave as we want them to is still kind of an active area of research. And there are new techniques coming out every day. But even with our current best practices, I would say we probably don't have 100% certainty that a model will always behave exactly as we want it to. So that's it for my portion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jessica. And I think in a way, perhaps continuing on what you discussed, which was really the vulnerabilities and risks of these systems, I think Hao-Nan will sort of follow up, and he share a few remarks that are in a way a continuation of this larger theme of safety and security of LLM systems. So Hao-Nan, please go ahead. I don't know if you have a PowerPoint, but you can of course share it.
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hao-Nan Li, a research fellow at MBCUAI, and I'm CTO at LibreAI. I'm excited to be invited to discuss about the safety of large language models. So previous speakers have talked about many interesting aspects. I will try to avoid repeating things that has been mentioned. So let's start. As pointed by all of us, we should acknowledge that the potential risk associated with large language models. These models, while powerful, are not infallible. Recent research work, which is featured by the Stanford AI indexing report today, they categorize the large language model associated risks into 6 areas and more than 60 fine-grained activities, as shown in this figure. The malicious use is obviously the biggest area, which includes more than 20 specific activities. For example, LLM can help in disinformation campaigns at scale. Besides, as large language models are trained on an ocean of data, which may include personal information that is inadvertently leaked online, large language models can memorize this information and cause the more severe leakage. Another potential risk is the generation of factually false information. For example, an LLM might inadvertently propagate bias or misinformation, which can have severe consequence in areas like news reporting, education, or decision-making process. Here are some examples of actually false large language model outputs. In the top left figure, LLM said Trump is black. We know that the United States is currently holding elections. Such misinformation and more severe disinformation may have bad impact to the candidates. I will introduce some solutions later to such information pollution. Knowing that large language models can output very harmful content. Now let's discuss some general safeguards that has been implemented to ensure the safe operation of large language models. These measures are designed to guide the AI to behave, behavior and prevent the harmful output. I will use JAIS, the first Arabic large language model today, as an example. During the development of JAIS, we consider 4 levels of safeguards, which is also used by many other open source or commercial models. So firstly, we have safety through training or fine-tuning. This involves adjusting the model to respond appropriately to certain type of questions. For instance, if the user asks how to make a bomb, the chatbot should be programmed to respond with a refusal to assist, which will also emphasizing the importance of ethical boundaries. Another safeguard is safety through prompting. Since large language models can understand natural language and is trained to follow instructions, this technique involves providing the model with instructions to guide the model how to be responsible. An example prompt might be like, do not encourage or provide instructions for unsafe, harmful, or unethical actions. We have also implemented many other safety measures, like using external model to detect harmful content or use keyword matching to filter bad responses. By incorporating these additional layers of scrutiny, we can better ensure the AI's outputs align with our safety and ethical standards. However, there's a phenomenon that's just mentioned by Jessica, which is called the jailbreak of large language models. This refers to the process of overriding or bypassing the constraints of or safety measures in a generative AI. It is a serious concern as it can potentially lead to the generation of extremely harmful content, which undermine the efforts of AI safeguards. This figure shows the amount of research papers about jailbreak in the last year. We can easily see that from the last year, the research about jailbreak have increased quickly. The red bars are papers about how to attack the language model. You can see that the attack methods are the most focused direction. To better illustrate jailbreak, here are some examples of jailbreak strategies. The first one is to directly instruct the model not to output refusal words. As has mentioned, the language model are trained to follow instructions, so we can tell the model to not refuse, do not say any refusal word. This is pretty effective when you are asking the jailbreak the language model. There's another example, which is multilingual jailbreak, where in English, the model is well trained to be safe. But if you simply translate the question into some low resource languages, it may answer these risky questions. The last example uses the personification ability of large language models, where we can give the model a persona and ask questions that such persona may answer. So we know that jailbreak is a task that's full of imagination, so that many researchers are interested in that. However, we still hope researchers to focus more on the safeguards of these jailbreak methods, rather than only contributing to how to jailbreak the model. At MBZU AI, the first AI university of the world, responsible AI is our mission. Our acting provost Tim Baldwin has working on fairness and general AI safety for many years. And our chair of NLP department, President Nakov's research interest is on fact-checking and fake news detection. At our startup company, Libre AI, we have developed open red teaming, which is the activities that against jailbreak. We also have open fact-checking and large language model evaluation service. Here is an example of our fact-checking, which is a solution to the misinformation we talked before. Given text, our system will decompose the text into claims and judge each claim's correctness by retrieved evidences, which will be helpful for fake news and other misinformation detection, especially in this area that there are heavily information pollution. Last, we appeal everyone to support responsible AI development, including all open source projects or commercial activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanan. That was excellent, and thank you to all of our speakers. We're already beginning to collect questions in the Q&A function. So I will just start actually with a question I had promised Dan I would follow up, but someone already asked in a way my follow-up question, so I will combine them. So you mentioned in your presentation that one of the sources of data you used was you uploaded I believe it's 30,000 pages of doctrine and of text. So what are what other kind of data or of sources can be leveraged for some systems? And I'll also combine this with a question that came from one of our participants, who is asking, what are the challenges when it comes to using LLMs for extracting insights from images and videos? So not just text.
Thank you for that. So I'll start with the second part of your question first, which is pulling out from images and diagrams and those types of information sharing methodologies. So for imagery, I think that that's a relatively not solved problem, but more mature technology. So being able to look at satellite imagery and identify specific objects of interest is something that, you know, many militaries have kind of explored and matured quite a bit since 2016. So that's something that's relatively capable right now. The challenges of using like a diagram or a graph, those are considerably harder. And I think that we're still a little ways away from being able to leverage those types of things. So I could think about, you know, the types of graphs that I've seen written onto PowerPoint slides are sometimes very difficult for just a human to be able to evaluate, let alone for a machine with very few examples. So for the second part of your question, regarding the types of documents and information that's loaded. So we tend to think about this from a standpoint of trying to organize your data based on domain. So if you are trying to understand economic information, make sure that that is somewhat organized, starting with logistics information, et cetera, and so forth. And by kind of narrowing the domain of the data that's available, you can then be a little more targeted in your questions and kind of reduce the chances that the LLM will start to confuse various sources of data across different domains. So I think that, again, with all artificial intelligence, it always starts with data first, and you can't just throw your entire share drive at one of these systems and hope for a good answer. You have to be a little bit more targeted. Hopefully that makes sense.
It absolutely does. Thank you for that very clear, really very clear answer. And so in a way to follow up on this, and it's a question that has been raised by someone in the chat, both to you, Dan, and to Rich, is, and you touched upon this a bit actually, both of you, when you discussed about how both the military and intelligence communities are institutions that have, you know, certain very established, very sort of old ways of even of doing processes. And how do you see, or how would you assess the role of the analyst evolving, considering the current but also potential future advancements of the technology? And in addition to that, what kind of additional training requirements you foresee to be necessary for people who use, for analysts, for operators who use, who rely on such systems? So perhaps I'll just hand it over to you, Dan, and then Rich can also contribute.
Sure. So I think that training will need to adapt. And to Rich's point about anthropomorphization as a backdoor to some of these cognitive biases that we've worked to try and reduce in the future, or reduce in current training, I think we will need to readdress how do we train an individual to best leverage the tool. Because again, as I kind of mentioned in my opening remarks, this is a tool, not a replacement for a human. And it's a way to augment their cognitive capabilities as opposed to replace it. So I think that some level of training of like, what does it mean to have a statistical distribution of information? What does it mean for a probabilistic versus deterministic response that you will see out of some of these systems? So that type of training, that type of awareness will be necessary in order for humans to best, or analysts, to best leverage the systems responsibly. I'm sure that Rich probably has far more kind of knowledge in this space than so I'll turn it over to him.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, in terms of how the analyst role might evolve, really LLMs are really a productivity tool, first and foremost, for analysts, where we are right now in terms of adoption of large language models. So what that basically means, what we're anticipating, is that the analysts will get more time to spend on things that add a lot more value to intelligence work. What I mean by that, actually, and this might surprise some people, how prosaic this might be, but collaboration across organizations, having more time to understand what are our allies doing, what do they think about this, doing more of that knowledge sharing. That's one of the biggest areas that the intelligence communities find extremely difficult to do, primarily because they don't have time. LLMs will basically move the analyst up the stack. That's the phrase that we use, and it moves. What we hope is going to happen is that it will move an analyst from being reactive and responding to what is happening in the world and trying to make sense of what has happened. So trying to make sense of history. It's interesting, actually, just a slight aside, that but really good intelligence analysts tend to have a background in history. They studied history at school. So that tells you something quite interesting about this sort of post-event investigation that has been the hallmark of intelligence analysis for decades. That's the thing that will likely to change the most, because it shifts analysts from being reactive to being more about strategizing. Actually, as opposed to what intelligence can I glean from this data, you move the analyst up to thinking about, how do I stop the next terrorist attack? What intelligence or data, what allies should I be working with that's going to actually help me prevent something happening, rather than this sort of post-event analysis? I think that's where the main shift, that's the main hope from using the LLM, primarily to be a productivity enabler, to allow the analyst to move up the stack to be much more strategic.
Thank you. And not to put just Dan and Rich on the spot, but I'll ask another question just for the two of you, because I feel it's more relevant. And then I'm just trying to group them a bit, the questions that are coming in the chat, and then I will address some questions to the other speakers who are more closer to the topic of their presentations. So someone is asking, for example, in the context of crisis management, and if we were to deploy, for example, large language models to support in the context of crisis management, what part of a crisis management sort of process would you think LLMs are best fitted to respond to? So, for example, the decision-making parts, or situation awareness, or scenario thinking, or to support in decision-making. So if you're just to sort of reflect a bit on what bit of the process of crisis management you think LLMs are most suitable to support effective human decision-making, what would be your answers? And perhaps I'll hand it to Dan first, and then to Rich.
Sure. So I think that when we talk about crisis management, really what we're talking about is we are now further time constrained to deal with a higher risk situation. So all of those phases that you kind of outlined of situational awareness, supporting decision-making, those are all becoming far more compressed just because of the nature of where we are. So really where I think large language models can provide value is one, understanding the historical context of this crisis. So if you think about something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, constrained to a few days, information awareness, a naval blockade, those types of things can be then evaluated in the historical context of naval blockades that have come in the past, doctrine of Russian and US actions, to help inform the decision-making process. But so that's looking at it to inform decision-making process, but also from a standpoint of, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the amount of information that's available to leverage is just far too great than any number of individuals can really understand. So being able to distill open source intelligence, intelligence reports, and be able to then find the needle in the stack of needles that are coming in, that is really necessary and important for supporting that crisis management. And the idea is to, again, look for areas to off-ramp and de-escalate, as opposed to if you give, if someone has a hammer, they're going to use the hammer to solve the answer. But if you give them more tools, then they're more likely to view the range of possible solutions.
Yeah, just following off from what Dan said there. So it's a great question, because I actually was involved with two projects that were seeking to answer exactly this question. I'll just give you a brief readout of what we covered. So one project, we were looking at how do intelligence analysts respond to the use of AI models in high stakes, very time constrained situations. And as Dan said, context is king. It all depends on the context. So, for example, what we were showing, we did some focus groups with intelligence analysts, and we were saying, hey, look, this AI model has identified this chat in some sort of forum somewhere that we know that people get radicalized, and it looks like someone's saying there's going to be they're going to launch an attack this morning in London. Okay, so that was the scenario that we played through with these analysts. Their response was immediately, I don't know if I can trust the output from that model, but I need to act on it because this is now a top priority. If it's a false positive, if the LLM was wrong, I'd rather be wrong and waste a bit of time, prove that it was wrong, than ignoring it and actually prove that it is actually a true positive. So context is, so whenever we talk about the use of AI in any high stakes situation, we have to talk about the context. So that was the first project. The other project we were looking at was strategic decision making. So this is sort of ministerial level, sort of the top of government level, and how they respond to AI, basically saying that this thing is happening. I can't go too much into the specifics of that particular project because we haven't published the report yet. But what I will say is this, specifically around the use of large language models, where you've got strategic decision making, where it's going to have a real world impact on a country, such as should we implement this COVID policy? Should we actually take our troops into that country? We talked about that level of decision making. Large language models would be really, really good at looking at the case history of previous decisions that have been made at the very top of government historically for similar looking events. Because actually there's a very large human element to any use of AI, which is, am I going to get in trouble by making this decision? Have I covered my backside? Is there a previous precedent? Senior decision makers love previous precedents because they feel like a lot of the hard work's been done. They've got comfort in knowing that they're not the first people to confront this particular situation. So using LLMs to bring that history so they can very quickly go, we dealt with something like this 12 years ago. That was the government at the time. This is what they did. So it may not be an obvious way to use large language models, but we have to think about where can they be used in a sufficiently valuable but sufficiently well manageable way.
Wonderful. That's also a great way, to a sort of a great conclusion to this question. So now, staying in the area of risk assessment, and I will turn to Rita, I believe, and perhaps Jessica is also would also be interested to answer this question. So someone is asking in the chat, when we speak about risk assessment and prediction, there are concerns related to large language models exhibiting emergent behaviors. So especially with I think you were discussing this, Rita, the RLHF, so reinforcement learning from human feedback. There are concerns of large language models developing emerging deceptions, so where the LLM learns how to best appease the human user by analyzing their preferences. So how can we predict such behaviors in the system, and are they truly spontaneous, or what is really happening, and how can we mitigate this situation? Perhaps Rita can start first.
So just to clarify the question, we want to understand what kind of methods can be used if the language model tries to kind of match that, what I am expecting to see or hear or read, whether it is true or false, or...
Yeah, so the question is rather, so first of all, if you can clarify this idea of this notion of emergent behaviors and emergent sort of even capacity of sort of deception of the system, and how can this be mitigated, or rather how can the behavior of such large language models be predicted? So how can we best predict that it might behave, or it might prompt certain answers that are in this context of perhaps deception, or just trying to appease the user but not necessarily providing the right content. So how can we sort of you as computer scientists, as data scientists, how can you assess the likelihood of this happening, and how can you respond to it?
Yeah. I am just thinking about, like, in this direction I haven't worked until now, but we have colleagues here who have worked also with hallucination approaches and how to detect when the model actually hallucinates. The first idea that comes in my mind is just to kind of verify what kind of outputs the model would make in multiple samples. That's like not really for the real, like, normal end user who just uses a language model and then just sees its output and kind of uses the output for various purposes. But like, in generally, if we would like to assess the model's output, like the quality and whether we should trust it or not, like we could ask the model to generate multiple samples and then analyze the quality of these samples and how well these samples actually align to each other. Like for the hallucination case, we have worked on an approach where we just examine whether the statements that are produced by the model are contradictory. So that can be done by just analyzing, like, whether the I don't know, named entities and their relationships, how they are used in the outputs, whether they are aligned if the model just produces multiple outputs. Not quite sure if this is exactly that direction, but maybe Jessica can help, and then I can spring back, like, jump back into the conversation.
Sure. Yeah, so in terms of like technical mitigations for deception, I am not extremely familiar with what techniques are being used there. I'm more familiar with the evaluation space because I know it's like an area of interest. People are specifically interested in this capability. And the few examples that I've seen are pretty contextual. I remember one that was based on, the model was basically asked to emulate the behavior of like a stock trader essentially, and then like placed in various scenarios. So basically they were having the model role play in various scenarios and then were able to elicit some like deceptive or like dishonest behavior in that specific context. So I think basically all this to say, I think we're still in the early stages of even figuring out like reliable ways to evaluate this kind of behavior. Because I think it's important to distinguish between basically like forcing the model to behave in a certain way and then like understanding the context in which this behavior might kind of arise organically, if that makes sense. Yeah, but I think I perceive it as still as we're in fairly early stages, and I think this is like one of the considerations that like people need to be thinking about when they are thinking about like where should I be using this model, like where should I be embedding it. So I think of it more as like you're basically doing risk assessment based on your specific context.
Thank you. So related to this, there are several questions in the chat, and I'll try perhaps to combine them. Again, related to risk mitigation, and the one of the greatest concerns related to, at least at the moment, related to the use of large language models. Something also perhaps that is more likely given where the technology is now. Perhaps it's not yet able to help produce, I don't know, new biological weapons, but perhaps the risk of supporting sort of disinformation campaigns at scale is greater at the moment. So there are a few questions in the chat on this, and I think one is even directly asking Haunan if you can share a few thoughts on what are the biggest challenges when it comes to detecting misinformation and disinformation when it comes to the use of large language models. What are sort of the results that your research showed, and how can we detect basically when LLMs are or would be used in such a way?
Thank you. So from my end, I think to retrieve the reliable evidence is the biggest challenge for detecting misinformation or disinformation, because nowadays we believe that Wikipedia might be a very reliable evidence, and no matter others say anything, we can give an evidence from Wikipedia to prove that they are right or wrong. But because the large language model is evolving fasting, and there are a lot of news that there's no evidences in some reliable evidences or websites. So how to retrieve the most reliable things is, I think, the most biggest challenge.
And someone is also asking, in a way related to this, if you can clarify, also because you worked, you were part of the team that helped build the largest Arabic language model. What are some of the unique challenges of developing large language models in across languages? So both challenges in terms of data, in terms of training, in terms of safeguards. If you can share perhaps a few, of course, very general, sort of high-level conclusions for our audience.
Okay, from my point of view, the biggest challenge of developing a large language model in other languages that other than English, I think is availability of the amount of tokens. You know that we have a lot of English data online, and we can easily crawl a lot of data and train a very big model. But for other languages, especially for some low resource languages, it's very difficult to get the resources or get the corpus of such language. So it's almost impossible to train a very big language model. Yeah. But to mitigate such things, we are trying to mix things such language with English, using the mixed data to train the model. We want to leverage the abilities that learned in English and make it transfer to some other languages. That is our current solution.
Thank you. So I think we'll take one more question related to risks from the chat, and then we move to a bit in the space of discussing safeguards, but also a few other related issues that we haven't really talked about in the presentations, but perhaps our experts can clarify. But just to say that just to raise this question that was asked, and I think perhaps Jessica was going to also cover this in her presentation, and you already mentioned a few points there that. Of course, there is this concern still that large language models could be employed for acquiring, for example, WMD, weapons of mass destruction capabilities. So, if we look at where the technology is now, and sort of in a technical sense, what do you foresee as some of the concrete risks that exist, and also related to a potential terrorist use of large language models? So where is the technology, and what are sort of the limitations, and also the safeguards that exist to prevent this at the moment?
Sure. Yeah, I think, again, it's kind of an open area of research. I have some coworkers who work specifically on the biosecurity angle, and I think one useful thing that they have shared kind of like with our organization as a team is the idea of like marginal risk. So like I think it's really important to be able to measure like what's the difference that like an LLM introduces to a bad actor compared to their existing access to tools like Google. And again, I think this differs based on what for CBRN like risks, which are chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear like weapon risks. I think those differ like within the domain. So it's like, for example, for bio risks for chemical weapons, you probably need access to a lab. So maybe it's not necessarily the information, like getting the compound name that you want to synthesize. It's like access to materials in the labs that might make the real difference, and that might be like a policy lever it's easier to restrict the materials than it might be the information. So I think that's an example of like, is the information introduced by the large language model, will that actually make the difference to someone who's thinking about committing one of these acts? In the cyber domain, I think it's a little different. I think we've mentioned, kind of like it's easier, like the capabilities I think are more mature in that space, just because I think these language models have been trained on more code than probably more information about how to build nuclear weapons. So I think we're probably a little bit ahead in terms of the cyber domain, but again, we're not seeing kind of like these models generating capabilities beyond what our like most capable human actors are already capable of. But again, I think it's very important to be able to kind of measure progress.
Thank you. And I have a question now for, I think, I would say Rita and Haonan, because I think it's a bit closer to your, also to the topics of your presentation. So someone is asking, so considering the proprietary nature of private AI technologies that is employed in LLMs, how can states ensure accountability and transparency? So I think this is rather a question related to open models versus models that are closed. So how can we, what are sort of the different challenges in either, and how can states ensure that the systems are deployed in a transparent and in an accountable way? And perhaps, Rita, you can also share a few thoughts here on your own work on explainability and how, even though, of course, it's the question is more specific, but what are some of the challenges of having systems having the systems be explainable, and then how can states perhaps elevate this as an obligation or as a requirement when it comes to large language models?
Yeah, that is a very good question. Like, there are many people that are currently working on this direction to understand like how to actually assure that we have like, or we use models that are actually safe to the end users. But that's first thing is just to consider what kind of problems can actually occur, and like to understand all the like the context and in which kind of situations these models are used. And basically what we need are some regulations of that, like when exactly to use these models, maybe also like how these models are trained, what kind of data is used for training these models, because like those examples that I showed you before, like many things are related to that, what kind of training data actually has been fed into these models. And if we train models that are like where we use data from the internet, where there are different kind of issues with this data itself, like what kind of languages used, what kind of I don't know, like different things that we don't actually want the language model maybe to learn about different concepts. One thing that I showed was about like women versus men, how the model actually encodes disinformation, like gender-related biases, things like that. It's like one good question is also what kind of representation should the model produce if the world is like that. So it's like we just need first of all to understand like what kind of representations, what kind of models we want to have for what kind of purposes, whether they should represent the world that we have and like the data that we have, or we want like a better representation of the world, basically unbiased models that would not actually represent maybe what kind of situation we have in different circumstances. Yeah, I think we just need to understand what our goals are also with these models, and like what kind of regulations would we need to make, like for the training process, where these models are used, by whom these models are used, and also like whether regarding also for the training of these models, like whether private data is actually used as part of the training data, and whether people want that it actually happens, if the information from the internet is just simply put into the training. Yeah, that is like just different thoughts on that. We just need to understand what our aims are, and then to specify regulations, and then there should be institutions who actually then verify whether these regulations are actually satisfied or not. But I think in this question as well, there are probably other experts that can provide more concrete answers on that.
I'll hand it actually to Haonan, because he worked a lot on, also on open models. So perhaps you can help clarify for us some of these challenges, and what are sort of the accountability measures that can be that we could think of for either more closed or open models.
Thank you. But actually, I do not have a clear answer to this question. So let me first clarify the questions. Are you asking? Sorry, can you repeat a bit?
No, okay. So I'll just simplify, because we're actually in the interest of time. So can you clarify what are some of the specific challenges of ensuring accountability in open models versus closed models? So what are some of the accountability or sort of the risks that we can identify? And very briefly, because we are really running out of time, and I would have liked to cover one last question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. From end, I think the closed models, they are relatively more safe and more easy to be responsible from the aspects of the output, because the companies can control the output, and they can avoid other users to customize the models. But for these open models, even for example, nowadays the safest model like Llama 2, researchers find that it is very easy to jailbreak it via very simple fine-tuning. So we can so simply saying that we use some malicious data to continue train the model, because it is fully open sourced. We can continue train that, and the model will become a very malicious model, and it can encourage a lot of bad things. This is a risk of an open model compared to the closed sourced models. So I think one very interesting research direction is to how to avoid the model, how to keep the model safe, even it is open sourced, even others want to customize it to be bad. This is a very interesting direction, I think.
Thank you. And I know that we are now 2 minutes past time, so I'm very tempted to answer to ask 2 more questions, but perhaps we'll close here, because we had some really interesting questions still coming, and one was that I thought was particularly interesting on LLM and agentic workflows. Or there's also an emerging discussion that I've come across in some of the the emerging literature on LLMs being used to control physical systems. So, for example, let's assume that a drone could be controlled by an LLM-based system, where we will have a language-based interface to control the system. And this could be another interesting area to look into, particularly in the context of our conversation on military uses and the implications for international security. But perhaps we'll leave that for another time. I want to thank all of you, first of the speakers, for excellent inputs, for your time and for your interest to join us, for the participants, for many questions. And I'm sorry that we are not able to touch upon all of them and to answer all of them, but this clearly shows that this topic receives a lot of interest, that it is an important topic to explore, and it's very pertinent to especially to the disarmament community here in Geneva, but not only, to discuss and to think about various applications of AI and in this case large language models, and the sort of benefits but also risks that they bring to the table. So I would like to thank you all once again very much, and you will have the recording of this webinar on our website. Thank you all very much once again, and have a nice rest of your day. Bye.